The sea does not remember names. It swallows ships, drowns kingdoms, erases entire civilizations beneath centuries of silence. And yet, somehow, it remembers him. 250 years after his final breath was taken from him on a black volcanic beach in Hawaii, the name James Cook still echoes across oceans. He was the first European to chart. Across coastlines he sketched with such precision that sailors would trust his maps for generations after satellites made them obsolete. But here is the question that has haunted historians for 2 centuries. How did a boy born into poverty, in a mud-walled cottage in the north of England, a boy with no fortune, no noble blood, no connections to power, become the man who redrew the map of the entire world? And more disturbing still, how did that same man, celebrated as a genius, a hero, a symbol of human curiosity and courage, end his life face down in the surf, stabbed and beaten to death by the very people who had once worshipped him as a god? To understand James Cook, we must go back. Back before the ships, before the fame, before the 3 voyages that would make him immortal, to a cold October morning in 1728, in a village called Marton, in Yorkshire, where a farm labourer named James Cook Sr. and his wife Grace welcomed their second son into a world that offered him almost nothing. There were no signs of greatness in that birth. No comet streaked across the sky. No prophecy was whispered. James Cook was born into the kind of poverty that swallowed most lives whole, a poverty measured not in money, but in possibility. His father worked the land of others, moving from farm to farm as opportunity demanded. And young James grew up watching mud, rain, and endless labor define the horizon of what a life like his was supposed to be. 8 children were born into that family. 4 of them did not survive childhood. Death was not an abstraction in the Cook household. It was a visitor that returned again and again, and somehow James was one of the ones who lived. By the age of 8, he was already working, first in the fields alongside his father, then through a stroke of fortune that would alter the entire trajectory of his existence, under the patronage of a local landowner who noticed something in the boy. Perhaps it was intelligence. Perhaps it was quiet determination. Whatever it was, it earned him something almost unthinkable for a child of his class: an education. He learned to read. He learned to write. He learned arithmetic. And in that arithmetic, unknowingly, lay the seeds of a genius that would one day allow him to calculate the exact position of a ship in the middle of an empty ocean, thousands of miles from any shore, using nothing but the stars. But formal schooling ended early, as it did for boys of his station. At 17, Cook was sent to work in a small grocery and haberdashery shop in the fishing village of Staithes, a place that clung to the edge of the North Sea, like it was daring the water to take it. It was here, standing behind a counter selling ribbons and sugar, that the sea first reached into James Cook's life, and would never let go. Staithes was a village entirely defined by the ocean, its people born to fishing boats, its economy built on cod and herring, its horizon nothing but grey water stretching toward infinity. Every day, Cook watched ships leave the harbour and return, watched sailors with weathered faces speak of places he had never imagined, and something inside the 18-year-old shopkeeper's assistant began to ache with a hunger that ribbons and sugar could never satisfy. Within 18 months, he had left the shop behind. He walked to the nearby port town of Whitby and apprenticed himself to a family of Quaker shipowners, the Walkers, who operated colliers, heavy, slow, unglamorous ships that hauled coal along the treacherous eastern coastline of England. It seemed on paper like an unremarkable career choice. Coal ships were not romantic. They were not warships. They were not vessels of exploration. And yet it was here, on these unglamorous, hard-working vessels, navigating some of the most dangerous and unpredictable waters in Britain, that James Cook learned the skills that would one day make him the greatest navigator in human history. The North Sea did not forgive mistakes. Sandbanks shifted overnight, Storms rose without warning, and Cook, still barely out of his teenage years, absorbed every lesson the sea offered him with an intensity that startled his employers. He devoured books on mathematics, astronomy, geometry, and navigation in his spare hours, teaching himself skills that most sailors of his era never bothered to learn. He was, by every account of those who knew him then, obsessively disciplined. A young man who seemed to understand, long before he had any reason to believe it, that the sea was going to be the vehicle of his entire destiny. By 1755, Cook had risen to the rank of mate, and the Walker family offered him command of his own ship. It was everything a boy from a mud-walled cottage in Yorkshire could have dreamed of. Financial security, respectability, and then James Cook did something that stunned everyone who knew him. He turned it down. Instead, at the age of 27, he walked into the Royal Navy and enlisted as an ordinary seaman, voluntarily giving up rank, comfort, and a guaranteed future to start again at the very bottom of one of the most brutal and unforgiving institutions in the British Empire. Why would a man abandon a captain's chair to become a common sailor? Historians have debated this decision for centuries, but the most compelling explanation is also the simplest. Cook did not want comfort. He wanted greatness. And greatness in 18th century Britain was not something merchant colliers could offer a man with no title and no bloodline. The Royal Navy, for all its brutality, was one of the only paths through which a commoner could rise on pure merit, skill, and endurance. Cook was betting his entire life on the idea that talent alone could overcome the walls of class that had trapped every generation of his family before him. It was a bet that would nearly cost him his life more times than history has bothered to count. And it began almost immediately, as Britain plunged into the 7 Years' War, a conflict so vast that some historians consider it the true First World War, fought across Europe, India, Africa, and the Americas. Cook found himself thrown into the heart of it, serving in North America during the British campaign to seize French Canada. And it was here, not in some future voyage of discovery, but in the chaos of war, that Cook's genius for map-making first revealed itself to the men who commanded him. In 1759, the British launched one of the most audacious military operations of the century, the assault on the fortress city of Quebec, perched high above the St. Lawrence River, considered by many to be unconquerable. But to attack the city, the British fleet first had to sail an enormous armada, dozens of warships carrying thousands of soldiers, up a river so treacherous, so poorly charted, so filled with hidden shoals and violent currents, that French commanders believed no British fleet could ever navigate it successfully. The river itself was expected to be Quebec's greatest defender. Cook was given the impossible task of charting it, often at night, often under fire from French shore batteries, rowing small boats into darkness with nothing but a lead line and a lantern, measuring depths by hand while enemy soldiers tried to kill him from the riverbanks. It was dangerous, exhausting, meticulous work, the kind that could get a man killed in silence with no glory attached to his death whatsoever. And yet Cook did it with a precision that left his superiors astonished. His charts of the St. Lawrence River were so accurate that the entire British invasion fleet was able to sail safely upriver, catching the French completely by surprise. Quebec fell. Canada, eventually, fell with it. And the balance of power in North America shifted permanently toward Britain, in part because of the extraordinary work of a former grocer's apprentice from Yorkshire, who nobody in London had ever heard of. But Cook's superiors had heard of him now, and they were paying very close attention. Following the fall of Quebec, the Admiralty assigned Cook one of the most demanding surveying projects in the Empire, the complete charting of the coastline of Newfoundland, a vast, jagged, fog-shrouded island whose waters had claimed countless ships and lives, and whose coastline remained, even after centuries of European fishing fleets working its waters, essentially unmapped in any scientifically rigorous way. For 5 summers, between 1763 and 1767, Cook worked along this brutal coastline, enduring fog so thick that ships would vanish from view 30 feet away, navigating icebergs that could shatter a hull without warning, and surviving storms that had killed generations of fishermen before him. It was during these years in Newfoundland that Cook transformed from a skilled navigator into something the world had never quite seen before. A scientific cartographer of near obsessive precision. His charts of Newfoundland were so exact, so far beyond anything British surveying had ever produced, that they remained the standard navigational reference for that coastline for over a century. Sailors were still using Cook's Newfoundland charts in the 20th century, nearly 200 years after he drew them by candlelight in a rocking ship, with instruments that would be considered laughably primitive by any modern standard. And it was in Newfoundland, in August of 1766, that Cook did something that would change the course of his entire life, though he had no way of knowing it at the time. He observed a solar eclipse and calculated its precise timing and location with such scientific accuracy that he sent his findings to the Royal Society in London, the most prestigious scientific institution in the world. It was an extraordinary achievement for a man with no formal scientific education, no university degree, no aristocratic sponsor. The Royal Society took notice, and 3 years later, when Britain needed a captain for one of the most ambitious scientific expeditions ever conceived, a voyage to the far side of the world to observe a rare astronomical event that would not occur again for over a century, a name kept surfacing in their discussions: James Cook. The event they needed to observe was called the Transit of Venus, the rare moment when the planet Venus passes directly between the Earth and the Sun, visible as a small black dot crawling across the Sun's blazing surface. Astronomers across Europe understood that if they could measure this transit accurately from multiple locations across the globe simultaneously, they could finally calculate something humanity had been chasing for centuries: the actual distance between the Earth and the Sun. It would unlock the true scale of the solar system itself. But the ideal location to observe this transit from the Pacific Hemisphere was a tiny, almost mythical island that few Europeans had ever seen with their own eyes, an island called Tahiti, only recently encountered by a British ship, rumored to be a paradise beyond anything Europeans had ever imagined. The Royal Society and the Admiralty combined forces, and in 1768, they placed 39-year-old James Cook, a man with no aristocratic background, no formal Naval Academy training, a man who had once sold ribbons behind a shop counter, in command of one of the most important scientific expeditions in human history. His ship was a converted coal collier, the very kind of unglamorous vessel he had once sailed as a young apprentice, refitted and rechristened as His Majesty's bark, Endeavour. Nobody watching that modest, unassuming ship leave Plymouth Harbour on the 26th of August, 1768, could have possibly imagined what it would become. It was not a warship. It was not built for speed or elegance. It was a sturdy, broad-beamed, flat-bottomed cargo vessel, precisely the kind of ship Cook understood better than any officer in the entire Royal Navy, because it was the kind of ship he had spent his entire youth learning to master. And on board, alongside 94 officers, sailors, marines, and scientists, was a young, wealthy botanist named Joseph Banks, whose personal fortune had funded his own participation in the voyage, along with an entire retinue of artists, servants, and scientific instruments. Banks would go on to become one of the most influential naturalists in British history, but on that departure day, he was simply a 25-year-old aristocrat with an insatiable curiosity about the natural world, about to embark on a voyage that would make him famous. The Endeavour sailed south, rounding the treacherous tip of South America, through the Strait of Le Maire, and around Cape Horn, one of the most feared passages on Earth, a graveyard of ships, where the Atlantic and Pacific Oceans collide in an endless war of currents, ice, and hurricane-force winds. Countless ships before the Endeavour had been destroyed attempting this passage. Cook brought his ship through it, with careful, patient seamanship, and pressed on into the vast, largely unmapped emptiness of the Pacific Ocean, a body of water so enormous that European mapmakers of the era genuinely believed a massive undiscovered continent must exist somewhere within it, simply to balance the weight of the land masses in the northern hemisphere. They called this hypothetical continent Terra Australis Incognita, the unknown southern land, and its search would become one of the great driving obsessions of Cook's entire career, one that would eventually carry him to the most hostile and desolate waters on the planet. But first, there was Tahiti. When the Endeavour finally reached the island in April of 1769, the crew encountered something that seemed almost impossible after 8 brutal months at sea. Lush green mountains rose from turquoise water, waterfalls cascaded down volcanic cliffs, and the Tahitian people, organized, sophisticated, and utterly unlike anything the sailors had encountered, greeted them with a complexity of customs, hierarchy, and culture that immediately shattered any simplistic European assumptions about primitive peoples. Tahitian society had its own political structures, its own religious systems, its own artistic traditions, its own deeply held codes of honor and hospitality. Cook, remarkably for a man of his era, approached these encounters with an instinct for observation and restraint that set him apart from many of his contemporaries. He established strict rules for his crew regarding trade and interaction with the Tahitians, attempting, not always successfully, to prevent the kind of exploitation and violence that had characterized so many earlier European contacts with indigenous peoples across the globe. It did not always work. Tensions flared. Misunderstandings led to theft, confrontation, and on one tragic occasion, gunfire that left a Tahitian man dead. The Endeavour's stay in Tahiti was a delicate, often contradictory dance between genuine scientific curiosity, cultural exchange, and the ever-present undercurrent of colonial power that shadowed every European voyage of this era. Joseph Banks and the ship's naturalists filled notebooks with descriptions of plants, animals, and customs never before recorded by European science. Astronomers set up their observation post on a stretch of land they named, with quiet irony, Point Venus, and on the 3rd of June, 1769, they watched as the tiny black disk of Venus crept slowly across the blazing face of the sun. The observation, frustratingly, was not as scientifically clean as astronomers had hoped. An optical phenomenon called the black drop effect made precise timing difficult, and the Transit of Venus project would ultimately produce less definitive data than scientists across Europe had dreamed of. But the voyage itself had already become something far larger than its original scientific mission. Because tucked away in Cook's official orders he was instructed not to open until after the astronomical observations were complete, was a second secret mission from the Admiralty. He was to sail south and west, deep into unmapped Pacific waters, and search for the mythical southern continent that European geographers had theorized about for centuries, but no ship had ever confirmed. Cook opened those sealed orders, and the true adventure of his first voyage began. He sailed south from Tahiti, and in October of 1769, the Endeavour's crew sighted land that would forever alter the course of history for millions of people not yet born: the islands of New Zealand. Only one European expedition, that of the Dutch explorer Abel Tasman over a century earlier, had ever glimpsed these shores, and Tasman had never actually set foot on land, fleeing after a violent encounter with the indigenous Maori people that left several of his crew dead. For over 100 years, New Zealand remained almost entirely a mystery to the outside world, its true shape and size completely unknown. Cook would spend the next 6 months meticulously charting its coastline, nearly the entire circumference of both islands, with such extraordinary accuracy that his maps of New Zealand remained the definitive reference for generations. But the human encounters proved far more volatile than the geographic ones. The Maori people Cook and his crew encountered were formidable, sophisticated warriors, organized into complex tribal societies with deeply ingrained codes of honor, territory, and ritual combat. Early encounters were marked by violence and tragedy on both sides, misunderstandings about intent, sacred customs unknowingly violated, weapons misread as threats. Several Maori were killed in confrontations with Cook's armed crew during the expedition's early days in New Zealand waters. Deaths that Cook himself recorded with what appears to be genuine regret and reflection, an unusual quality for a European commander of this period. As the weeks passed, however, more peaceful and even collaborative relationships began to develop in certain regions, with trade, cultural exchange, and mutual curiosity gradually replacing the initial hostility. Cook's journals from this period reveal a man wrestling, imperfectly, inconsistently, but genuinely, with the moral complexity of what his presence meant for the people whose land he was charting. From New Zealand, Cook made a decision that would prove to be one of the most consequential choices in the history of European exploration. Rather than returning home the way he had come, he turned the Endeavour westward, sailing into completely unknown waters in search of the eastern coastline of a landmass that Dutch explorers had partially charted decades earlier and named New Holland, a continent that would one day be known to the entire world as Australia. On the 19th of April, 1770, a young officer aboard the Endeavour sighted land rising from the horizon, the southeastern coast of Australia, a stretch of coastline no European had ever laid eyes on before. Cook named the point of land Point Hicks, after the officer who first spotted it, and turned the ship northward, beginning the meticulous work of charting a coastline that stretched for thousands of miles, a coastline entirely unknown to the cartographers of Europe. 8 days later, the Endeavour sailed into a wide, sheltered bay, and Cook and his crew went ashore for the first time on Australian soil. What they found stunned them: an extraordinary abundance and diversity of plant life, unlike anything Joseph Banks and his fellow naturalists had ever encountered. So rich and unprecedented that Cook renamed the location Botany Bay, a name that endures on maps to this very day. But the human story of this landing was far more fraught than the botanical one. The local Aboriginal people, the Gwegal, watched the massive foreign ship approach with what Cook's own journals describe as remarkable indifference. They largely ignored the Endeavour entirely, continuing their daily activities as if the arrival of an enormous alien vessel from across the world meant nothing to them at all. When Cook's landing party attempted to come ashore, however, 2 Gwegal men moved to oppose them, and in the tense confrontation that followed, Cook ordered his men to fire, wounding one of the men. It was a violent, uneasy beginning to a relationship between the Aboriginal peoples of Australia and European civilization that would, in the decades and centuries to follow, become one of the most devastating and tragic chapters in the entire story of colonization. A chapter that Cook himself, in that single moment on that beach, could never have imagined the full weight and horror of what was to come. Cook continued charting the eastern Australian coastline for months, a task of extraordinary danger and precision, because lurking beneath the seemingly calm turquoise waters was one of the most treacherous natural formations on the planet, the Great Barrier Reef, an enormous, largely submerged labyrinth of coral stretching over 1,000 miles, capable of tearing open a wooden hull without any warning whatsoever. And on the night of the 11th of June, 1770, that is precisely what happened. The Endeavour struck coral in the darkness, and the sound that tore through the ship was one every sailor aboard would remember for the rest of their lives: a grinding, splintering shriek as the reef ripped a gaping hole through the hull. Water poured into the ship at a terrifying rate. Every man aboard understood in that instant that they might be about to die on the far side of the world, on a coastline no European had ever mapped. What followed was one of the most extraordinary displays of seamanship, discipline, and sheer nerve in the entire history of maritime exploration. Cook ordered the crew to lighten the ship immediately, throwing cannons, ballast, and supplies overboard to reduce weight and buy precious time. Men worked the pumps in exhausting, unrelenting shifts, fighting to keep the rising water from drowning the ship entirely. And in a desperate, ingenious act of improvisation, the crew performed what sailors called fothering, wrapping a sail thickly coated with wool and manure around the outside of the hull, which was then drawn tightly against the damaged section, where water pressure forced the material into the wound and dramatically slowed the flooding. It was a technique that should not have worked, that seemed almost primitive against the scale of the damage, and yet it did work, buying the crew just enough time to nurse the crippled Endeavour toward the nearest shore. They beached the ship for repairs near what is now the city of Cooktown in northern Queensland, and it was here that the survival of the entire expedition hung by the thinnest of threads. It took 7 weeks to repair the hull sufficiently to continue the voyage. 7 weeks during which Cook's crew, for the first time on the voyage, formed a sustained and relatively peaceful relationship with local Aboriginal people, the Gugu-Yimithir, who taught the stranded sailors about local plants, animals, and in one moment immortalized in the English language itself, the word for a strange, powerful, leaping animal the sailors had never seen before, an animal whose name entered the English vocabulary from that very encounter. When the Endeavour finally limped free of the reef and continued its voyage home, Cook had accomplished something almost unprecedented. He had charted over 5,000 miles of previously unknown coastline in New Zealand and Australia, claimed the eastern coast of Australia for the British Crown, survived a mere fatal shipwreck on the most dangerous reef on Earth, and brought his ship and the vast majority of his crew home alive. Of the 94 men who left England, 70 would return, and remarkably, almost none of the deaths were from the dangers of the voyage itself. Nearly all the casualties came later, from disease contracted at a stopover in Batavia, in modern-day Indonesia, where malaria and dysentery swept through the exhausted crew with a cruelty that the ocean itself had never managed to inflict on them. Cook returned to England in July of 1771 and found himself almost overnight transformed from an obscure ship's captain into a national celebrity. His charts, his scientific discoveries, and the sheer audacity of his voyage captured the imagination of an entire nation hungry for stories of adventure and discovery. He was presented to King George III. He was promoted, and within a year, before the ink on his own fame had even fully dried, the Admiralty was already planning to send him back out. This time, to answer the question that had driven European geographers mad for centuries. Did Terra Australis, the great southern continent, actually exist? Cook set sail again in July of 1772, this time in command of 2 ships, the Resolution and the Adventure, on a voyage that would push the boundaries of human endurance and geographic knowledge further than any expedition before it. His mission was audacious, almost to the point of madness. To sail as far south as any ship had ever gone, circling the bottom of the entire globe in search of a continent that might not even exist, through waters so cold, so violent, and so utterly unknown that no rational sailor of the era believed survival was guaranteed. What followed was one of the most extraordinary feats of exploration in human history. Cook drove his ships deeper into the Southern Ocean than any vessel before them, through mountains of ice, through storms of a violence that veteran sailors described as beyond anything they had experienced, into cold so extreme that rigging froze solid, and sails had to be beaten with clubs simply to unfurl them. And on the 17th of January, 1773, the Resolution became the first ship in recorded history to cross the Antarctic Circle, a line of latitude so far south that no human being had ever confirmed crossing it before. Cook and his crew pressed on, again and again, circling the frozen edges of the unknown continent, coming at certain points so close to Antarctica itself that they were separated from discovering it by mere miles of ice and fog. Close enough that some historians believe Cook may have glimpsed the edge of the actual continent without ever fully realizing what he was seeing. But Cook, made a decision in those icy waters that revealed the depth of his character as a leader. He determined that even if Terra Australis existed, it lay so far south, buried beneath such catastrophic ice and cold, that it would be of no practical use to any nation, and that continuing to push his ships and his men into ever greater danger in pursuit of a landmass with no habitable value was a risk not worth taking. He turned his ships north. It was, in many ways, an act of extraordinary restraint from a man who had built his entire reputation on pushing further than anyone thought possible. Proof that Cook's genius was not merely fearlessness, but judgment, the wisdom to know precisely when courage tipped over into recklessness.